It was 3 in the morning, a time when the city seemed quieter than usual, immersed in a stillness so dense it could almost be felt in the air. The cold night air seeped through the open windows, while I, engrossed in the light conversations of the evening, had completely lost track of time. That night was another filled with chats and laughter with friends, one of those moments that revitalizes you after a long, exhausting week. However, that small corner of peace and joy would soon change completely, transforming into something I could have never imagined experiencing. My phone vibrated gently, reminding me that it was time to head home. Monzi, my friend, and I exchanged glances, both realizing how late it had become. I decided to stay a little longer, waiting for Monzi's friends to return from the store where they had gone to get more beer. As we waited, we continued chatting, but something in the atmosphere felt off, though at the time, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was a faint sense of unease that emerged from the silence of the night. Finally, her friends returned, bringing a bag of chips, my favorite, as a thank you for staying. Without thinking much of it, I placed the bag on the windshield of my car as we said our goodbyes, and I prepared to head home. The walk wasn't long, just about 15 minutes of peaceful walking. But at that hour, with the deserted and dark streets, it always made me slightly uneasy. I got into the car, adjusted the rearview mirror, and started driving slowly, feeling the weariness accumulate in my shoulders. I drove slowly, both out of caution and habit. At that hour, the streets of my neighborhood took on a mysterious air, wrapped in shadows that made every corner seem hidden under a cloak of darkness. There was no traffic, no lights on in the houses, and the only sound was the tires on the asphalt, breaking the absolute silence. The only thing disrupting the calm was my own breathing, growing more and more aware of the darkness around me. As I continued, the cemetery by the side of the road appeared on my left. It was a place I always avoided looking at directly, especially at night. The graves, visible behind the low fences and flickering streetlights, looked like ghostly figures in the distance. I had passed by there many times during the day, but at night, it looked completely different. No matter how many times I traveled that road, the unease the cemetery stirred always managed to creep into my mind. I slowed down even more as I approached the darkest and roughest part of the road. The pavement became uneven, and the car shook slightly with every meter. The headlights barely illuminated a few meters ahead, leaving the rest of the road cloaked in impenetrable darkness. That's when I saw them. At first, they looked like mere shadows moving in the distance, something I could have attributed to fatigue or a trick of the light, but soon I realized that wasn't the case. 4 figures were moving strangely, almost unnaturally. At first I thought they were animals, maybe dogs or cats, but their movements were too erratic. They jumped, but not like a person or an animal would. Their bodies propelled into the air, with their ankles coming together in a way that was so unnatural, it sent a shiver down my spine. They were too small to be adults and too large to be children, but their proportions deeply unsettled me. Instinctively, I lifted my foot off the accelerator, slowing down even more as my eyes adjusted to the darkness surrounding those figures. As I got closer, their silhouettes became clearer, and what I saw took my breath away. They weren't people, at least not as we know them. They were small beings with human proportions, and the most terrifying thing was how they moved with a speed and agility that defied all logic. The air inside the car became heavy, and my heart began pounding in my chest. I felt cold sweat on my hands as I gripped the steering wheel tightly. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but every time I blinked, the figures were still there, moving in unison, jumping as if performing some sort of macabre dance. Suddenly, one of them stopped dead in its tracks and looked straight at me. It was wearing a strange suit, like a harlequin's. I couldn't help but recall a horror story I had heard on a podcast, but what I saw on its face was beyond comparison. It was a mix of mockery and malice, but the most frightening thing was the lack of humanity in its eyes. I felt as if it was watching me with a cold, almost inhuman intelligence, and at that moment, I knew that this night would be one of the most terrifying of my life. Fear began to overwhelm me. That creature stood motionless in the middle of the street, staring at me as if it had been waiting. The harlequin suit it wore was disturbing, its colors muted by the darkness, but what scared me most was its face. From a distance, I could barely make out its expression, but the contours of its face were unmistakable. It wasn't a human face, but something twisted, as if time had deformed it in an unnatural way. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, but I couldn't look away. The other three figures continued to jump, oblivious to what was happening between us. They leaped in unison, as if performing some kind of grotesque ritual, and every time their ankles came together in the air, a wave of nausea overcame me. Their movements were so strange, so erratic, that I couldn't comprehend what was happening. Despite the terror I felt, my body wouldn't react. I couldn't accelerate. I couldn't reverse. I was trapped in that moment. Suddenly, the other three creatures crossed the street with agility, disappearing into the darkness of the vacant lot on the other side. The way they did it, so quickly and precisely, made me realize I wasn't dealing with something normal. My thoughts tangled with the growing fear, but I still couldn't take my eyes off that solitary figure. The Harlequin was still there, watching me from a distance. The silence was absolute, broken only by my labored breathing and the thundering of my heart in my ears. Finally, that thing leapt to the side as if to follow the others. But before disappearing, it turned its head once more in my direction, as if to make sure I had seen it. My stomach churned. That thing wasn't human, and what I had just witnessed had no rational explanation. At that moment, I knew the worst was yet to come. Trying to regain control, I looked ahead, trying to ignore the dizziness overtaking me. But what I saw paralyzed me with terror. Something was on the hood of my car. My breath caught for a second, and I closed my eyes tightly, hoping it was just an illusion, something conjured by my exhausted mind. But it wasn't. I knew it was real. It was there, so close to me that its presence weighed on me. I forced myself to open my eyes, though fear told me not to. And there it was, that same figure, but much closer now. Its face was a nightmare, disfigured, aged, with an expression of hatred and mockery that sent shivers down my spine. Its face seemed to have been deformed by time, as if it had been buried for centuries, only to emerge now to torment me. The worst were its eyes. Empty, dark, yet within that void seemed to dwell a darkness so profound that I felt as if all the warmth in my body had been ripped away in an instant. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was completely paralyzed, staring at that thing so close to me, almost at eye level. I wanted to scream, but fear had stolen my voice. My body wouldn't respond to anything but the terror. Time seemed to stop. I don't know how long I was there, staring, feeling that at any moment it would break through the windshield and drag me with it to wherever it came from. But in an act of pure instinct, my body reacted. My hands, moved by some unknown force, gripped the steering wheel, and my right foot slammed down on the accelerator with all my strength. The engine roared, and the car surged forward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still there, watching me. As I drove off, I caught a glimpse of the bag of chips, the one I had left on the windshield, flying through the air. It was a trivial detail, almost ridiculous in the midst of such terror, but in that moment, everything felt surreal. I sped up even more, trying to leave behind that image, that figure that had been watching me. But even though it was no longer on the hood, though I couldn't see it anymore, its presence still enveloped me. My mind struggled to process what had just happened, but it couldn't. The images of the disfigured face, the empty eyes, replayed in my head like a broken film. My heart wouldn't stop racing, and even though I knew I was moving, a part of me remained trapped in that moment, in that encounter with the unexplainable. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, about what I had felt. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I arrived home. But the fear didn't leave me. I knew I had left that place behind, but the feeling that something was following me didn't go away. I felt that if I got out of the car, if I turned off the engine, that thing would be there, lurking in the shadows. My whole body trembled as I opened the garage gate, and every passing second made the air feel heavier. I knew something was about to happen, something worse. The gate closed with a metallic screech, echoing in the darkness. That sound made me feel even more vulnerable, as if that barrier wasn't enough to keep out what I had left behind. I turned off the engine, but my hands remained gripping the steering wheel. I didn't dare let go, as if contact with something tangible could keep me anchored to reality. The garage was shrouded in shadows, illuminated only by the faint light from the street filtering through the gate slats. I knew I had to get out of the car, but something was stopping me. The fear still gripped my chest, and the image of that thing on the hood kept replaying in my mind. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. My phone was still on the passenger seat, its screen dark and silent. I picked it up, turning on the flashlight to illuminate my surroundings. The light, though small, gave me a sense of security. I convinced myself that if I moved quickly, nothing would happen. But as I opened the car door, the cold air of the garage made me hesitate. It felt as though something was waiting for me in the shadows, something I couldn't see but knew was there. Each step toward the door of my house was a battle against panic. The light from my phone cast long shadows on the walls, and every time my gaze drifted, I felt as if something was moving in the corner of my eye. My mind played tricks on me, making me imagine that at any moment that terrifying figure would reappear from some dark corner. I knew that if I didn't get inside quickly, the fear would completely paralyze me. My heart was beating so fast I could barely hear my own thoughts. I reached the door of my house, but my hands were shaking so much I couldn't fit the key into the lock. The sound of the metal scraping against the lock only increased my anxiety. I kept repeating to myself, "Focus, focus." But the images of what I had seen wouldn't stop flooding my mind. The disfigured face, the empty eyes, the sensation of being followed, it all wrapped around me like a cloak of terror. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and hurried inside, slamming it shut behind me. The sound of the lock sliding into place gave me a small sense of relief. I rushed upstairs, trying to leave behind the feeling that something was following me. My mother was in the hallway when she saw me arrive. Her face showed surprise and concern. "What's wrong? Why do you look so pale?" she asked, approaching me quickly. I tried to calm down, but the fear was still gripping my chest. Like a second skin I couldn't peel off. The words caught in my throat before I could tell her what had happened. With shallow breaths, I began to recount what I had seen. Every word made me relive the terror of those moments. My mother, though trying to stay calm, couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. She listened intently, and as she did, I felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief because I could share what I had lived through, but fear because in telling it, I realized that what I had seen wasn't just a fleeting illusion, it was real. Her face changed slightly as I finished telling her everything. She tried to smile to reassure me and said in a relaxed tone, "That's what you get for being out so late, dear." Though it was a comment meant to break the tension, I didn't find it funny. In that moment, every word about what had happened felt like a warning that something more was coming. My mother didn't grasp the magnitude of what I had experienced. Something had changed in me. I went up to my room, closing the door behind me and turning on all the lights. I couldn't bear the thought of being in the dark, not even for a second. However, exhaustion was starting to take over, and though my body begged for rest, my mind wouldn't allow it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those figures jumping unnaturally. My room, which had always been a safe haven, now felt small and oppressive. I lay down on the bed, leaving the lamp on the nightstand on. My heart was still racing, and though I tried to distract myself with my phone, the feeling that something was wrong in the room wouldn't go away. The silence grew heavier, and that sensation of being watched returned. I couldn't shake the thought that that thing, that being I had seen in the street, might still be nearby, lurking in the shadows of my own home. Finally, exhaustion won over fear, and my eyes began to close. But as I drifted into sleep, the terror lingered. I knew that the experience wouldn't end with the morning's arrival, because something inside me had broken that night, something that wouldn't be easily repaired. And though I wished it had all been just a nightmare, deep down, I knew that what I had seen was real, and that somehow it would return. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight timidly slipped through my bedroom curtains, but their light didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. My body was exhausted, as if I hadn't rested at all. I sat up in bed, still feeling a weight on my chest. I had slept with the lamp on, but even that didn't stop me from waking up several times during the night, startled, with the sensation that something was watching me from the corners of the room. There was something in the air, a sense of threat that didn't disappear with daylight. I got up, trying to shake off the heaviness I felt, and went to the bathroom. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. I had deep, dark circles under my eyes, pale skin, and bloodshot eyes. It looked like I had aged years in a single night. As I washed my face with cold water, I felt that same chill I had felt the night before in the garage, as if an invisible presence was behind me. I froze in front of the mirror, unable to turn around. The memory of the tall shadow I had seen in the reflection came rushing back to my mind. For a moment I thought it had all been just a nightmare. Maybe the exhaustion had played a trick on me. Perhaps what I had seen the night before was just a product of my imagination, amplified by fear and darkness. But something inside me knew that wasn't the case. I knew that what I had seen was real, and that the encounter wasn't over. I felt that something had stayed with me, something I couldn't see but that was present in every corner, in every shadow of the house. During breakfast, I tried not to talk about the subject with my mother. I didn't want her to think I was becoming paranoid, though deep down I was beginning to question myself. However, I couldn't help but notice how she looked at me with concern, as if she knew something wasn't right. She didn't ask questions, but her silence held a palpable unease. The house was too quiet, and every little noise, the creaking of the wood, the whisper of the wind, made me jump. It was as if the atmosphere was charged with a strange energy. I decided to leave the house for a while, hoping that the daylight and routine would distract me from what had happened the night before. I drove around the city, running small errands, trying to keep my mind occupied. But as the sun began to set, my anxiety grew. I didn't want the night to come. I didn't want to feel that vulnerability again, that sense of being hunted by something I couldn't understand. The darkness now represented something far more threatening than I had ever imagined. I returned home as the sky was darkening, with a knot in my stomach as I turned the key in the lock. I knew I was entering that space again where fear had trapped me the night before. The house was empty. My mother had gone to visit a friend, and the silence inside enveloped me immediately. I walked toward my room, turning on all the lights as I passed, making sure not to leave any corner in shadows. But despite the light, that feeling persisted. It was as if something was there, hiding in the spaces I couldn't see. When I reached my room, I sat on the bed and looked around. The walls, once so familiar and safe, now seemed oppressive, as if they were too close, as if they were trying to trap me in that space of terror. My phone vibrated on the nightstand, and the sound made me jump. It was a message from Monzi, asking how I had gotten home the night before. I hadn't spoken to anyone about what had happened all day, but somehow, just seeing her message made me feel a little more connected to reality. I replied briefly, saying that I had arrived safely, but had seen something strange on the way. I didn't know how to explain to her what I had experienced without sounding completely crazy. While I waited for her reply, the phone vibrated again, but this time it wasn't a message. My skin prickled when I saw the notification on the screen. It was the episode of Tales of the Night that we always listened to together, the same one we used to put on to pass the time. The strange thing was that I hadn't opened it, and yet there it was, ready to play. For a moment, I thought my phone had activated by mistake, that it was just a coincidence. But then the podcast music began to play, that same unsettling melody that marked the beginning of each story. My heart raced. It was the same episode I had listened to the night before, just before everything started. This couldn't be a coincidence, not after everything that had happened. Fear gripped me again, and I felt the walls closing in even more. I quickly turned off the phone, throwing it onto the bed as if it were a threat. But the echo of the music continued to resonate in my mind, reminding me that what had happened wasn't over. I knew something was happening, something I couldn't control. And the worst part was that, no matter how hard I tried to escape, I felt that this presence would follow me, that no matter how many lights I turned on or how many doors I closed, it would always be there, waiting in the shadows. That night, the silence in the house felt more oppressive than ever. Every corner, every shadow, every little creak in the walls resonated like a warning. Even though my mother hadn't returned yet, I felt like I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain why, but there was something in the atmosphere that made me feel watched. Despite having turned off my phone, the podcast's melody kept replaying in my head, like a distant echo that I couldn't shut off. I sat on the bed, staring at the closed door, listening for any sound out of the ordinary. The previous night had been a nightmare, but what I felt now was worse. It wasn't just fear. It was the certainty that something had changed in my life since I saw those figures in the street. It was no longer just the terror of having experienced something unexplainable, but the sense that that experience had followed me, that the darkness had clung to me and didn't intend to let go. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made me jump. My breath caught for a moment, but then I recognized the familiar noise of my mother's heels. The door opened slowly, and she entered with a tired smile. "How are you?" she asked in a soft tone, as if sensing the tension in the air. I tried to smile, but I couldn't. Everything inside me was too tense. "I'm fine, Mom," I replied, though my voice didn't sound convincing. She watched me for a moment, and then, as if she knew I needed space, she left me alone. I wanted to sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that disfigured face, the strange jumps of those figures, the empty eyes that had stared at me. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to escape the images that kept replaying in my head. And then, I felt something strange, a pressure, as if the air in the room had become denser, heavier. I opened my eyes and the lamp on the nightstand began to flicker. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to get up to check the lamp, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped in bed, unable to move, as if something invisible was holding me down. The flickering of the light grew faster, almost frantic, and in that moment, I felt a presence. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, in the darkest corner of the room, right where the light didn't reach. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Panic enveloped me and my mind searched for a rational explanation, but there was none. The flickering of the light suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, and then I saw it, or at least, I thought I did. It was a shadow, tall and thin, moving slowly toward me. It was the same shadow I had seen in the mirror the night before, but this time, it wasn't an illusion. I felt the cold wrap around me, a cold that chilled me to the bone. The shadow had no face, but its presence was unmistakable. Every second that passed, it came closer, and I still couldn't move. My breathing became fast and shallow as the shadow stopped at the foot of the bed. I couldn't see it clearly, but I felt its gaze fixed on me, a gaze that didn't need eyes to make me feel exposed, vulnerable. The air around me seemed to stop. There was nothing but that shadow in me, in a room that had suddenly become too small to contain so much fear. And then, the shadow spoke. It wasn't a normal voice. It was a whisper, a murmur that echoed in my mind more than in my ears. "I've been waiting for you," it said. My hands gripped the sheets, and I felt my heart was going to explode. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew it wasn't just a hallucination. It was real. Everything I had felt, everything I had seen had led to this moment. I closed my eyes tightly, hoping it would disappear, that it was all just a bad dream. But the voice continued, whispering things I didn't understand, in a strange, ancient language that made me feel like I was losing control. My mind fought not to sink, but the terror dragged me deeper and deeper into the abyss. I knew that if I kept listening, something inside me would break forever. Finally, the voice stopped, and the weight I felt on my body lifted. The air flowed again, and I slowly regained control of my body. I sat up abruptly, my heart racing and cold sweat soaking my skin. The shadow was gone, but the fear remained, deeply rooted. I knew it wasn't over. This wasn't just a visit. That presence, that darkness was now a part of me.